Let's begin with the chapter Changes and Development in Rural Society. First, let's start with the definitions. What is a rural society? Well, it is one that is based in a village. The rural economy rests predominantly on agriculture and allied activities. These societies have a low density of population and they also have a close face-to-face group relationship. In this society, land is an important form of property and not just a form of livelihood. Also, agriculture is not only a form of livelihood but a way of life. How, you might ask? Well, many of our cultural practices and patterns can be traced to our agrarian background. Example, most of our New Year festivals in different parts of India, such as Pongal in Tamil Nadu, Bihu in Assam, Vaisakhi in Punjab, and Ugadi in Karnataka, actually celebrate the main harvest season and herald the beginning of a new agriculture season. Thus, there's a close connection between agriculture and culture. Both culture and social structure in rural India are closely bound up, though the nature and practice of agriculture varies greatly across the different regions of the country. And this variation is reflected in the different regional cultures. Note, the economic activity of agriculture is not the only rural occupation. Other activities that support agriculture and village life are also sources of livelihood in the village. Example, the potters, the carpenters, the weavers, the ironsmiths, and the goldsmiths. The other specialist occupations taken up in a rural society are that of storytellers, priests, astrologers, oil pressers, and water distributors. The rural social structure, which is reflected in the caste system, has a specialist caste called the Jajman and a service caste called the Kamans. This is called the Jajmani system, and this is a traditional jati-based division of labor in Indian villages in which the lower castes performed various functions or services for the upper castes and received grains or other produce in return. Now, some of the traditional occupations have declined, while new occupations have sprung up due to the rural-urban economic link. Example, people employed in the postal and educational departments, or the government services, or in the army, or the factory as factory workers, etc. So now let's move on to the next subtopic, that is the agrarian structure. So, what is the agrarian structure? Well, it refers to the structure of distribution of land holdings, as land is the most productive resource and ownership of land dictates the rural class structure. In a village, not everyone has land. In fact, 40 to 50% of the families do not own any land and are dependent on agricultural labor or other work for their livelihood. In most regions of India, women do not have any land ownership rights. This is because of the patrilineal system of inheritance and the kinship system. Despite laws for equal share of family property, the women have only limited rights and some access to land. So we see that people have varying access to land and therefore can be categorized into number 1, medium and large landowners, number 2, agricultural laborers, and number 3, the tenants. Now let's go over them one by one. Medium and large landowners are able to earn sufficient income from cultivation, which of course is subject to market fluctuations. The agricultural laborers do not own any land and are more often paid below the statutory minimum wage. Their earning is low and their employment is also insecure. They are mostly daily wage workers who are without agricultural work for a considerable time during the year, and this is called underemployment. The third category are the tenants, and they lease land from the landowners and then they work on the land. They have less income than the owner cultivator as they have to pay often as much as 50 to 75% of the income from the crop as rent to the landowner. The agrarian society has a class structure which is derived from the caste system. There's a complex relationship between caste and class in rural areas. It is not necessary that higher caste Brahmins would be the major landowners in a particular area or have higher incomes. In each region, there are usually just one or two major landowning castes who are also numerically very important. M.N. Srinivas called them the dominant caste. They are the most powerful group, whether economically, politically, and they dominate the local society. For example, the Jats and the Rajputs of Uttar Pradesh, the Jat Sikhs in Punjab, the Vokaligas and the Lingayats in Karnataka, etc. The dominant landowning groups are usually middle or high ranked castes. Marginal farmers and landless lower caste groups are officially classified as the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes. Now let's look at agricultural laborers. The agricultural laborers mostly are untouchables or belong to the Dalit caste, as they were not allowed to own any land and thus were easily exploited for their labor, allowing the landowner to have the land intensively cultivated so as to get higher returns. Typically, the upper and middle castes had best access to land resources and hence to power and privilege. In most regions of the country, a proprietary caste group that owns most of the resources and can command labor to work for them arose. Practices such as begar or free labor were prevalent in North India. The lower rank caste groups had to provide labor for a fixed number of days per year to the village landlord or zamindar. Many of the working poor were tied to landowners in hereditary labor relationships. Note, this practice has been legally abolished. Also, most unequal agrarian practices were found to have developed in those areas where there was plentiful irrigation, whether that irrigation is natural or artificial. For example, the Kaveri Basin, where rice is grown on a large scale, and this is in Tamil Nadu. Here you would find a lot of exploitation as more labor was needed for agriculture. These regions were also characterized by a large proportion of landless laborers who were often bonded workers belonging to the lowest castes. Now let's look at land reforms. And what we have is that each region came to be dominated by just one or two major groups, and there are historical reasons behind this. In the pre colonial period, these castes were also probably cultivating castes. However, they were not direct owners of the land. They had to hand over a substantial amount of their produce to the ruling group. That could be the local kings or the zamindars, usually a kshatriya or a higher caste member. When the Britishers colonized India, they ruled through these local zamindars, granting them property rights and more control than they had before. The colonizers imposed heavy land revenues or taxes on agriculture. The zamindar then extracted as much money as they could from the cultivators. The net result was the decline in agricultural productivity. Peasants fled from oppressive landlords, and frequent famines and wars decimated the population. This was the zamindari system. Now let's have a look at the Rotwari system of land settlement. The Rotwari system, which has the word Rayat meaning cultivator in Telugu, were the actual cultivators, and they were the landlords and were responsible for paying the tax. Hence, the colonial government dealt directly through the actual cultivators or landlords instead of any overlords. Therefore, the taxation burden was less and the cultivators had more incentive to invest in agriculture. So areas became relatively more productive and prosperous. So now let's look at independent India and the agricultural productivity after independence. Well, the agricultural productivity after independence was very low, and there was a high dependence on imported food grains. Also, there was a high level of poverty. So, our policymakers realized that for agriculture to progress, it was necessary to bring about a reform in the agrarian structure, that is, the land holding system and the distribution of land. So, in 1950s to 1970s, land reform measures were passed at both the national and state level. The first prime change was the abolition of the zamindari system. So, by abolishing this system, in effect, the layers of intermediaries between the cultivators and the states were removed, and thus their power was weakened. And so was their economic and political power. The second step was the abolition of the Tenancy and Regulation Acts. This was affected to either outlaw tenancy altogether or to regulate the rents so as to give some security to the tenants. However, in most states, these laws were never implemented very effectively. In West Bengal and Kerala, where they were, we find a radical restructuring of the agrarian structure that gave land rights to the tenants. The third reformation was the Land Ceiling Act, that is, an upper limit of land that could be owned by a family. Now, this varied from region to region and also on the type of land, that is, whether the land was highly productive or unproductive. Land over the limit was supposed to be redistributed to the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes. Now, the laws had loopholes, and this allowed the people to retain the surplus land. In fact, the rich farmers actually divorced their wives on paper while they still continued living with them, so as to avoid the provisions of the Land Ceiling Act, as unmarried women were allowed a separate share of land. Now, this is called Benami transfer. So, what we see that land reforms are necessary to boost agriculture, eradicate poverty in rural areas, and bring about social justice. Now, this brings us to the Bhudan movement or the land gift movement, also known as the Bloodless Revolution. It was a voluntary land reform movement in India, and it was initiated by Vinoba Bhave in the early 1950s in Telangana. It aimed to bring about land reforms through a movement rather than relying solely on government legislations. Land was voluntarily gifted by the affluent to be redistributed to the landless poor. This was aimed for addressing the agrarian issues of social inequalities. This movement achieved some measure of success. Another noteworthy movement is the Operation Barga that was launched in 1978 by the West Bengal government. This movement was initiated by the government to protect the interests of the burgardars and provide them some security against eviction by the landlords. The landlords used to regularly exploit their tenants or burgardars either by evicting them just before the harvest season or by giving them a minuscule share of the produce. This movement was very successful in West Bengal. Now we move on to the social consequences of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution can be studied under two phases. The first phase, that is between 1960s and 1970s, brought about significant changes. Now, this Green Revolution was actually a governmental program of agricultural modernization that was funded by international agencies. In this, packaged technology was used, that is, the high yielding variety hybrid seeds, pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation, and other inputs. In those areas where there was an assured supply of irrigation, which was very important for the seeds and cultivation, the agricultural productivity grew manifold. So we have the wheat and rice growing areas of Punjab and western Uttar Pradesh, the coastal regions of Andhra Pradesh, and parts of Tamil Nadu experiencing the first wave of the Green Revolution package. So we have the agricultural productivity increasing sharply because of the new technology and India becoming self-sufficient in food grains for the first time. So agriculture-wise, the Green Revolution spelled success. Now let's look at the social effects of the Green Revolution, particularly the negative effects. Well, the Green Revolution was primarily for the medium and the large scale farmers. They were able to benefit from the new technology because the inputs were expensive and the small and marginal farmers could not afford it. So these medium and large farmers were able to produce a surplus for the market, and they were the ones who were able to reap the most benefit from the Green Revolution and from the commercialization of agriculture that followed. The peasants also could not take advantage of the Green Revolution because they were only able to produce for their own subsistence. So, the first phase of the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s seemed to be increasing inequalities in the society. The Green Revolution crops were highly profitable, mainly because they yielded more produce. The well-to-do farmers could increase their production and earn more money. This led to the displacement of the tenant cultivators. Also, it led to the displacement of the service caste group. The ultimate outcome of the Green Revolution was that it led to a process of differentiation. That is, The rich grew richer while the poor grew poorer. On the other side, employment and wages for agriculture workers did increase in many areas due to the increase in the demand for labor. However, the economic conditions of the rural workers worsened due to the rising prices and the mode of payment shifting from grains to cash. Now let's look at the second phase of the Green Revolution, and this was introduced in the dry and semi-arid regions. In these regions, there was a shift from dry cultivation to wet or irrigated cultivation, along with changes in the cropping pattern and the type of crops grown. The monocropping regime followed, and in the market oriented green revolution areas, the farmers became more prone to risk and financial ruin due to crop failure. Earlier on, they were able to spread their risks due to multi-cropping. So, green revolution spelled increased livelihood insecurity as farmers became more dependent on the market for their income. Another negative outcome was the increasing regional inequalities. West and southern parts of the country, and in Punjab, Haryana, and western UP, where green revolution was promoted, prospered. Agriculture in Bihar, eastern Uttar Pradesh, and Telangana remained relatively undeveloped. Some regions continue to have the feudal agrarian structure, that is, landed castes continued to maintain power over the lower castes, the landless workers, and the small cultivators. The sharp caste and class inequalities and exploitative labor relations gave rise to various kinds of violence, like intercaste violence. So let's try to understand the people's view of the scientific farming that was a part of the Green Revolution. And their perception is indicated by how they contrast the sampurn or the wholeness of the organic produce with that of the hybrid produce. Many rural people believe that the hybrid varieties are less healthy than the traditional ones. In fact, Indian farmers have been for centuries cultivating, and they have extensive traditional knowledge regarding seeds, the soil, and the crops that they sow. Much of this traditional skill and knowledge is being lost as hybrid and genetically modified varieties are being promoted as more scientific and productive. However, now a number of scientists as well as farmers suggest a return to the traditional way of farming after examining the negative environmental and social impact of scientific farming. So, what was the transformation like in the rural society post independence? Well, for one, those regions that underwent the Green Revolution experienced deep seated changes in the nature of the social relations in rural areas. Well, first, there was more demand for agricultural labors due to the increased cultivation. Secondly, the form of payment from grains was replaced with cash payment. Third, the hereditary relationship between landowners and the agricultural workers, known as bonded labor, became weak. Fourth, there was a rise of free wage laborers. So, to a certain extent, we can say that there was a shift from patronage to exploitation. Social changes took place in many areas where agriculture was becoming more commercialized and market oriented. So there was a transformation in labor relations, and there was a transition to the capitalist mode of production, which means that the workers are separated from the means of production, that is land, and there is the use of free wage labor. With increasing commercialization of agriculture, the rural economy became integrated to the wider economy. More money flowed into the village and expanded opportunities for business and employment. Note this transformation had begun during the colonial period, but it picked up speed and spreadability post independence. The government promoted modern methods of cultivation. The state invested in rural infrastructural development like irrigation facilities, roads, electricity, agricultural inputs, and gave credit through banks and cooperatives. The recently launched Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Gram Jyoti Yojana is an effort of the government in this direction. The aim was not only to transform the rural economy and agriculture, but also the rural society and the agrarian structure. Now, the question arises, how was the alteration of the rural structure brought about? Well, through the enrichment of the medium and large farmers who adopted the new technology. The well-off farmers of the dominant castes in the agriculture-rich regions such as coastal Andhra Pradesh, western UP, and central Gujarat began to invest their profits from agriculture into other business ventures. This created a class of entrepreneurs who moved out of rural areas to the towns. These new group of elites became economically well off and politically dominant. So this changed the class structure, and with this several elites opted for higher education for their children, who then joined white collar jobs and became professionals or started their own businesses. Now, those regions that didn't have effective land reforms or lacked in political mobilization and the redistributive measures have not experienced any changes in the agrarian structure and rural society. For example, the eastern parts of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. States like Kerala underwent a different kind of development because of their linkage to an external economy, that is, the Gulf countries. The rural economy of Kerala is a mixed economy in which political mobilization, redistributive measures have integrated agriculture with retail sale and services along with remittances from abroad, and this has immensely changed the rural society. Now let's look at circulation of labor. Well, commercialization of agriculture has also led to the growth of migrant agricultural labor in the rural society. The prosperous Green Revolution regions such as Punjab have a high demand for agricultural labor. Since the traditional bonds of patronage between labor and landlords had weakened, a pattern of seasonal migration of laborers circulating between their home village and the more prosperous areas has become the pattern. Also, due to increasing inequalities in the village, many families take up multiple jobs to sustain themselves. Footloose, as this labor is, are not bound to any particular location or job. They're highly mobile and are willing to move place to place in search of work. These migrant workers come mainly from less productive and drought prone regions and are usually paid low wages. They also do not have many rights and suffer exploitation. Jan Bremen used the term footloose labor for these workers. Lack of job security has created very poor working conditions for these workers. Wealthy farmers often employ these migrant workers for harvesting and other intensive operations. Local workers are not employed for these tasks, as the migrant workers can be easily exploited and underpaid. The locals move out during the peak agricultural season in search of work. There is a peculiar pattern of circulation of labor that emerges. This pattern is found in the sugarcane growing areas. So this has several significant effects on the rural economy. In poor areas, the number of men who are working for most part of the year are outside their village, which leaves the women as the main cultivators. So we have a feminization of agricultural labor force in the village. Insecurity is greater among these female workers as they are paid less than men and the work that they do is similar. The prevailing patrilineal kinship system and other cultural practices exclude women from land ownership. Now let's look at globalization, liberalization, and the rural society. The question arises, how much has rural society been affected by globalization and liberalization? Late 1980s saw liberalization impacting the Indian agriculture by opening the Indian market to imports. After decades of state protection, the Indian farmer now had to compete with the global market. This had direct effect on the farmer and the rural society. For instance, farmers of some regions in Punjab and Karnataka entered into contract farming with multinational companies such as PepsiCo to grow potatoes and tomatoes. The company identifies what has to be grown, provides seeds and other inputs, along with the working capital and know how, and of course, the market. The farmer is assured a predetermined fixed price for the crop and guaranteed by the company that it will purchase the crop that is produced. So, in essence, the farmer and the company is bound in a contract, and the agricultural production carried out is as per this agreement, that is, it is called contract farming. So financial security is there for the farmers in that sense on one hand, and on the other hand there's also a feeling of greater insecurity in another sense. How? Well, the farmers become dependent on these companies for their livelihoods. Contract farming is very common for the production of specialized items like cut flowers, grapes, figs, pomegranates, gherkins. Now, let's examine the sociological significance of contract farming. Well, for one, it disengages many people from the production process. Secondly, it makes their own indigenous knowledge of agriculture irrelevant. Third, it caters primarily to the production of elite items. Fourth, it is not ecologically sustainable as it usually requires high doses of fertilizers and pesticides. The second wider aspect of globalization of agriculture is the entry of the multinationals into this sector as sellers of agricultural inputs such as seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers. The government has scaled down its agricultural developmental program, and so the agricultural extension agents of the government have been replaced by the company agents of seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers. These agents provide and update the farmer with the know-how, with the prime motive of selling their expensive seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers. This has led to an increased dependence of the farmers on these agricultural inputs and has reduced their profit, further pushing the farmers into debt and creating an ecological crisis in the rural areas. Due to the above mentioned structural and social changes in agriculture and the agrarian society, a new phenomena of farmer suicides has taken up. Such suicides have become matrix events, that is, a range of factors coalesce or combine to form an event. Sociologists have attempted to explain this as agrarian distress. This is because of the changes in the economic and agricultural policies, a changed pattern of land holdings, changing pattern of cropping due to the shift towards cash crops. The liberalization policies have exposed the Indian agriculturalist to the forces of globalization. Also, there is now a heavy dependence on high cost inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. Apart from that, there is the withdrawal of the state from the agricultural extension activities and a dependence on multinational seeds and fertilizer companies. Also, there has been a decline in the state support for agriculturalists, and there is a growth of the individualization of agricultural operations. So, all these changes have coalesced to become matrix events and they have impacted the Indian farmer. Suicides of farmers is basically associated with death and natural disasters resulting in the failure of agricultural produce. So, what is the solution? Well, the government of India has come up with various schemes for the farmers, like the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bhima Yojana, the Gram Uday Se Bharat Uday Abhiyan, and the National Urban Mission. So, these schemes will help provide quality of life to the rural Indian farmer.